Robin Falk was a small-town girl with small-town values, and the Oregon native always knew she wanted a traditional life, especially when it came to marriage.
I was raised very conservative, and, marriage was forever.
But in the summer of 1980, Robin was facing a life that was very different from the one she'd dreamed of. At 19 years old, she found herself pregnant, broke, and alone.
My daughter's father was a high school sweetheart, and when I got pregnant, the relationship ended. I didn't want my daughter to go without or be penalized for my mistakes. So it was really important for me to be able to give her everything that she deserved.
That spring, when her daughter Jakelli was 4 weeks old, Robin moved to her family's farm in Richland, Oregon to work for her father. And while Robin was focused on raising her daughter, she did strike up a friendship with a laid-back delivery man named Jerry Joe Wilson.
Jerry was tall and good-looking and very outdoorsy. When he'd come around, I got the little butterflies in my stomach.
The couple hit it off immediately.
Oh, we started dating right away. We had met, in the barn and just kind of started hanging out, going fishing together. We would catfish all night. It was just a done deal.
Robin loved everything about Jerry. But what really made her heart melt was the way he treated her daughter, Jakelli.
She was very happy that he was so good to her daughter. That was really, really important to Robin.
By November 1980, after just 4 months of dating, Robin and Jerry knew they would be spending the rest of their lives together.
We just knew that we were right, and we were going to be married.
And 1 month later, that's exactly what they did.
It was just a really quiet, small church wedding with close family and a couple of friends. It was beautiful. I just felt like I had everything.
The newlyweds moved into their own small home in Richland, and Jerry legally adopted Jakelli. In May 1982, the happy couple welcomed another daughter into the world.
After a couple of years living in Richland, we decided to move into Baker to be closer to Jerry's family. His parents were very welcoming. They actually had an extra house, and so we lived in their house.
It seemed Robin finally had the family she had always wanted. But soon she began to notice a troubling change in her husband's behavior.
Shortly after we moved to Baker, Jerry started not coming home after work. He would be gone overnight. He would be gone all weekend, supposedly fishing or hanging out with his friends. I saw a lot less of Jerry after we moved.
But Robin kept her worries to herself. After all, Jerry was a good provider. He took care of the family's finances, and when he was home, he doted on his 2 little girls. But just 6 years later, Robin's dreams of a happy family life would come crashing down. It all began on March 21st, 1986, when Jerry left home without telling Robin where he was going. He never came back that night.
It was very common for him to disappear without me knowing where he was.
But there was something different about this disappearance. And the next morning, when Robin heard a shocking report on the local news,
I got just this gut ache about it.
she had no idea that a nightmarish chain of events had begun.
Robin had no idea what was going on inside of Jerry's head.
My life changed forever. My life would never be the same after that.
In the summer of 1983, 3 years before Robin Falk's family was rocked by traumatic news, Robin and her husband Jerry were living a quiet life in beautiful Baker City, Oregon.
We were living in the house that Jerry's parents owned, and things were pretty good. He was gone a considerable amount of time, but he was working, and I was home with the kids.
Robin knew they were lucky to have Jerry's family close by. But just 3 years into their marriage, she noticed her mother-in-law acting strange when it came to money.
Well, my mother-in-law didn't drive. She never had. And so she would call and have me come and pick her up and take her to the grocery store. And we'd get to the store, and I would need to pick up a few things. And then we would get to the checkout stand, and she would pay for everything. It became a routine. It went on for quite some time. It was really uncomfortable for me. It was embarrassing because that's something I always took pride in, taking care of myself and being able to put food on the table.
Robin was at a loss, but didn't want to confront her mother-in-law, so she decided to discuss the matter with her husband.
So I asked Jerry about it, why his mom was buying groceries for us. And so I just kept pressing until he finally caved.
Robin was floored by what Jerry said next.
Told me that he didn't have a job, and his brother had been covering for him while he went and played all day. He pretended to work. He left every day. I made him a lunch, packed him a lunch, and he left and didn't have a job.
Even worse, Robin realized Jerry's entire family knew about the lie and had been hiding it from her.
Jerry was the baby. He had a lot of older siblings that always took care of him, and Jerry really couldn't do any wrong.
Robin was livid.
I told him that I wasn't going to live that way. I applied for a job, got it right away. That embarrassed him.
Ashamed, Jerry finally landed a job himself as a delivery driver.
I was hopeful that we'd be okay again.
Robin set about trying to move past her husband's deception. But Jerry's frequent absences from home only heightened her anxiety.
Well, with Jerry gone so much, it did make me wonder what he was up to. And of course, I didn't want to believe anything bad.
But later that summer, when a friend came to her with a disturbing rumor she'd heard around town, Robin was forced to face a heartbreaking reality about her husband.
A gal that I knew told me that he was cheating on me. She took me to the house where she thought that he was at with this gal, and his truck was there. I just wanted to throw up.
Robin immediately banged on the door, ready to confront them both, but no one answered.
I was hurt, I was mad, I had no idea what I was going to even say. If they'd opened the door, I probably would have just melted.
Distraught, Robin went home and waited for Jerry to return. And when he finally showed up later that day, Robin confronted him with what she had seen. But she wasn't at all prepared for Jerry's reaction.
He got very, very mad. He punched a wall and broke his hand. I had never seen him blow like that before. I'd never seen him explode, and I was afraid. I was really afraid.
Robin decided to leave well enough alone and drop the matter. She desperately wanted to keep her family together, despite her husband's disturbing dark streak.
I really didn't think about leaving him at that time. I had 2 little kids. He was a good father. You know, marriages stay together. You don't get married to get divorced.
Robin would have done anything that she could do to make it work.
Over the next few months, that's exactly what Robin set out to do. And in the fall of 1983, Robin discovered she was pregnant again.
I thought maybe having another baby would pull things back together.
But Robin had no idea that the darkness she'd glimpsed in her husband was still simmering, and it would soon explode in a terrifying way.
The more the detectives talked to him, the more they felt something was wrong.
In the summer of 1984, Robin Falk was pregnant with her 3rd child and trying desperately to keep her marriage together. But her husband, Jerry, didn't seem interested in doing his part.
After our son was born, It was pretty much, life as it was before. He was proud of his son, but didn't really keep him home.
Robin basically was raising those children by herself. She had no support.
Over the next 2 years, Jerry's long absences became increasingly frequent, and his explanations were starting to ring hollow.
I finally came to the point where I just really couldn't take it anymore.
On Friday, March 21st, 1986, Robin cornered Jerry at home and laid out her demands.
I confronted him there, and I told him that I couldn't go on like this anymore, that either something needed to change or I was going to have to leave, and that if I found out that he had cheated on me again, that it would be over. I would be done.
Robin wasn't surprised when her husband got up and left, rather than answer her plea.
I really thought that he was just going to go for a drive and come back.
But Jerry never came home that night. And the next morning, when Robin woke up, her husband was still gone. Robin was more worried about her marriage than ever, but her concerns would soon be overshadowed by a shocking report on the local news.
The news came on every hour on the hour, and they started talking about this lady that was missing from town. I got just this gut ache about it.
When it was first advised that we had a missing woman, we thought we probably had a problem. We don't have people just come up missing. So in this case, we felt it needed to be out to the public to try to get some answers.
The missing woman's name was Beth Williams. Baker City police detectives had been searching for her for 2 days, and they were about to get a surprising lead.
My first really clue came in when a woman that I knew had called me and told me that she had seen Beth leave a bar here in town with a gentleman by the name of Jerry Wilson.
Early Monday morning, police dispatched a detective to Robin and Jerry's house, just as Jerry was arriving back home.
Jerry wasn't in the house more than 2 or 3 minutes, and somebody knocked at the door. It wasn't anybody that I'd seen before.
I introduced myself as a policeman for Baker City, and I just asked Mr. Wilson if he would come down to the station and talk to me. When a policeman shows up at your house at 7:30 in the morning, asks you to come down and talk, first thing you want to know is why, and he didn't say that. I was beginning to wonder then if he probably had something to do with the disappearance of Beth Williams.
While Detective Rogers interviewed Jerry, another investigator contacted Robin and asked her to come to the police station for an interview.
They asked me a bajillion questions, same questions over and over. And they wanted to know if Jerry was home Friday night, when the last time I saw him. But they still hadn't told me why they were asking me all these questions.
After grilling Robin for hours, detectives delivered some chilling news.
First, they asked me if I had heard about this girl that was missing, and I said, yeah, I'd heard about it on the news. And they told me that they believed that Jerry was responsible. And I said, no way. There's no way.
Even worse, police were certain this was much more than a missing persons case.
After talking to him, we was sure that probably something bad had happened.
In March of 1986, Robin Falk received the most shocking news of her life. Baker City police were certain her husband, Jerry Joe Wilson, was suspect number 1 in the disappearance and likely murder of a local woman. Robin was distraught, but she refused to believe a word of it.
They had the wrong person. It wasn't Jerry. They were crazy. He didn't have it in him to do that. After I left the police station, I went back home, and Jerry had come home, and he told me that if the police questioned me, that I need to tell them that he was home Friday night. And I told him that I didn't know what he had gotten himself into, but I wasn't going to lie for him.
Despite her refusal to lie, Robin was certain her husband was innocent.
My first thought was he did something stupid, like maybe he was speeding and he outran the cops or something silly. He'd never been in trouble with the law, so I couldn't imagine him doing anything very bad.
Robin was just happy to have her husband back at home. And over the next few days, Jerry acted as if nothing had happened. He went to work and came home as usual. He told Robin he'd been cooperating with the police and had agreed to take a polygraph.
When he told me that he was going to do the lie detector test, I thought that would be good. You know, he could clear his name and there wouldn't be any more question. It would be over with.
But Robin's hopes would soon be shattered. That Thursday, Jerry took the polygraph test and failed.
Jerry finally called me, and he told me that he had been arrested. And he told me that he had done it, that he had killed her. Couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it.
Jerry told her the disturbing story of what had happened the weekend he disappeared. He confessed to having a one-night stand, but then things had taken a turn for the worse.
He said that he had picked her up in a bar, and they had gone out to my uncle's cabin. And then they got in a big argument. She told him that she knew that he was married and she would tell his wife. And when he heard that, everything that I had said Friday night came ringing back to him. And he knew that if I found out that I would leave.
And that's when the rage Robin had glimpsed in her husband boiled over.
The argument escalated and he killed her.
Jerry admitted he had used a rock as his murder weapon.
I was just devastated. I couldn't believe these words were coming out of his mouth. Like, it didn't make sense to me.
I could tell while talking to Jerry that this was bothering his conscience a lot. I told him that the family needed to know where the body of Beth Williams was to put it to rest. And I could see actually a sigh of relief when he finally told me where the body was.
Detectives immediately sent out a search party for the body of Beth Williams.
When they went to the body and the rock was found right there, practically on top of the grave with blood on it, what was found corroborated what he had said.
In April of 1986, Jerry Joe Wilson waived his right to a jury trial and, on the advice of his attorney, pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder. Despite his plea, that June, Jerry was convicted of murdering Beth Williams. He was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole. This time, Jerry's family could do nothing to help him. The months following Jerry's conviction were brutal for Robin and her kids.
My house started being broken into, and I was fired because I was bad for business. Jerry was locked away. He was in jail. I was the only one out there for them to get revenge on. I decided to move, to leave it all behind. I walked away from everything. I lost my house. I left my friends, and I went to a town where nobody knew me.
In June of 1987, Robin's divorce was finalized. Once again a determined single mother, Robin took her children and made a fresh start, ultimately settling in Alaska. Today, Robin is still the same small-town girl at heart. And now, 26 years after Jerry's arrest, she is finally living her small-town dream.
Life now is wonderful. I have 3 beautiful children, 9 grandkids. They are the light of my life. It's wonderful.
Robin believes the experience with Jerry has made her stronger. And that strength is displayed in her ability to move on and trust again.
I'm married to a very wonderful, supporting man. We have this really great relationship. We can go sit out on a boat all day long. And at the end of the day, we're still best friends. I think I look at things a little different than before. Sweeping things under the rug only works for so long. Eventually, it's going to sneak back out and get you.
At 20 years old, Audrey Mabry was ready to start a new life for herself.
I had been born and raised in the same town my whole life. I had just come out of a relationship, so I wanted to move out of my hometown and kind of start over.
In April of 2003, the small-town waitress moved from Fort Hood, Texas, to the city of El Paso. A couple weeks later, Audrey found herself home with nothing to do.
I was off from work one day, bored out of my mind, and got onto the computer and just got into a random chat room. I noticed a screen name that popped out to me that was black and bold for you. I had always been attracted to black men, so I clicked on the name.
And Audrey was pleased to discover that the man behind the eye-catching handle was equally interesting. His name was Chris Haney, a New York City police detective and single father of 2.
He said he had been previously engaged and he had 2 children from that relationship.
Chris also told Audrey he was 35 years old, 15 years her senior. But Audrey didn't mind.
I thought to myself, this is a guy that knows where he's going in life and is on the right track.
I think what drew Audrey to Chris was that he was different from her other relationships. This was a stable man with a stable job.
Before long, Chris and Audrey were talking non-stop on the phone. And a few months later, Chris invited Audrey to the Big Apple so they could meet in person.
This was absolutely a crazy idea, but the fact that he was the cop made me feel like I could trust him.
On June 9th, 2003, when Audrey first laid eyes on Chris, she was instantly captivated.
His smile was humongous, the biggest smile I had ever seen in my entire life, and I was immediately drawn to it. He puts his arms around me, and I'd never felt so safe. And I just thought to myself, this is the guy I'm gonna marry.
In October of 2003, Audrey moved to New York to be with her new love. But shortly after Audrey moved in with Chris, he came to her with a confession.
He expressed to me that he was not 35, he was actually 38. I had some concerns about that, but thought to myself, it was kind of silly. It was only 3 years. He wanted to appeal to a younger girl, and that's why he did it.
Audrey let the matter go. There were more exciting things to think about. Her relationship with Chris was flourishing, and she soon met his ex-fiancé and their 2 children. Chris was still on good terms with them, and all 3 accepted Audrey instantly.
It made me feel amazing that they were so welcoming to me, and it gave me hope for our future.
In the fall of 2004, after 1 year of dating, Chris proposed, and Audrey gladly accepted. Just a few months later, the happy couple discovered Audrey was pregnant.
I didn't really want to raise my children in New York City, and I told him I always wanted to live in Florida, so we sort of formulated this plan.
Chris purchased a lovely home for his new family in Apollo Beach, Florida. And in April 2005, Audrey moved in while Chris stayed behind in New York to finish his last year with the police force. On September 10th, 2005, Chris and Audrey welcomed their son into the world.
The long distance was difficult, but Chris would come every 5 weeks to visit, so we would still see each other pretty frequently.
It seemed nothing, not even distance, could stop the couple. Until 4 years later, when Audrey discovered the man she loved was hiding an unimaginable evil. Audrey's nightmare began the afternoon of November 17th, 2009. She had just finished a run and stopped by the house to freshen up.
Chris was not supposed to be home that day.
But Chris was home. And when Audrey opened the front door, she stopped dead in her tracks at the horrifying sight that greeted her.
As soon as I entered, there he was with a butcher knife in his hand and charges at me.
Audrey was terrified, but she had no idea that this was just the beginning.
If he wasn't gonna have her, no one was gonna have her.
I see blood dropping to the floor. And in my mind, I'm like, what the hell is going on right now?
In the spring of 2006, 3 years before Audrey Mabry found Chris Haney waiting for her with a butcher knife, the young mother was living in Florida, anticipating the arrival of her fiancé.
Chris had to stay in New York because he was still, a cop. He had 1 year left until he was going to retire. It was pretty lonely, but we had experienced it before in the very beginning, so we were kind of good at it in a sense.
Despite the distance between them, Chris and Audrey were making it work. But just a few weeks later, while Chris was still in New York, his brother and sister-in-law came to Florida for a visit, and they unwittingly delivered some distressing news.
And it was at a dinner where his sister-in-law asked me if Chris and his wife were divorced yet.
Audrey was confused. Chris had called the mother of his 2 children his ex-fiancée.
I felt betrayed. I felt like I had been living a lie the entire time. I confronted him about it very quickly, and he admitted that not only had he been married, but he was in fact still married.
But Chris insisted that the marriage was in name only, and it was simply to keep their children on his health insurance.
Every part of me was screaming to leave, but I stayed because we hadn't even had an opportunity to be a family yet.
A few months later, Chris finally retired from the police department and joined Audrey and their infant son in Florida.
When Chris came down to Florida, he promised he would get divorced. My hopes from that point on was to make it work.
And over the next few years, that's exactly what the couple did. Chris got a security job, and Audrey juggled plans to go back to school while working part-time at a restaurant.
I started babysitting for Audrey shortly after Malachi was born. They were the best parents. Chris seemed like a loving father who would do anything for his child.
And in the spring of 2008, Chris kept his promise. He finalized his divorce, and Audrey realized she was pregnant again. The happy couple decided it was finally time to tie the knot. Audrey and Chris exchanged vows in the summer of 2008, on the same day they had met 5 years earlier.
I was emotional in the midst of it. I felt like I was fulfilling this dream that I had since I was a child.
6 months after the wedding, Audrey gave birth to another bouncing baby boy. The newlyweds were so proud of their growing family. But Audrey's hopes for a lasting marriage would suddenly come crashing down less than 2 years later. In the fall of 2009, just as Audrey started going back to school, Chris came to her with a disturbing confession that destroyed everything she had tried to build.
He said, listen, there's something that I've been hiding from you. I've been gambling. I always knew that Chris enjoys to gamble, and that was always fine with me, as long as he paid every bill that we had.
But Audrey had no idea how much Chris's habit had been costing them.
He had gambled 2 months of the bills away. And I asked him, well, what do you mean? And he said, I mean everything. I haven't paid it in 2 months. So I was angry.
Exhausted by the thought of having to dig out her family financially and disgusted by Chris's irresponsible behavior, Audrey knew she had to get out of the marriage.
It was constantly lies. I felt like you're 40-something years old and you still don't have your priorities straight. So I decided that I was done for good. The first thing out of my mouth was, I want a divorce. And he was not happy with that, but my mind was made up.
Even though Audrey was determined to move on with her life, keeping the peace for the kids was important. And Audrey was pleasantly surprised when Chris seemed to be handling things like an adult.
I expressed to him that I would be moving out December 1st of that year. We worked opposite shifts, so I didn't really have to see him a lot. So things were civil.
But what happened next made Audrey think twice. Just a few weeks later, Chris picked Audrey up from work, and right away, she knew something was very wrong.
He met me at the bar right next door from my job and came in, had a beer, had a shot, and he wasn't a heavy drinker either. On the car ride home, he began telling me how I was his wife and I still had wifely duties that I needed to fulfill. I thought he was joking.
But once they arrived home, Audrey quickly realized Chris was dead serious.
I went into the bedroom and, like, out of nowhere, I find myself up against the wall and then thrown on the bed. Before I know it, he's trying to unbutton my pants, puts his hand over my mouth and says, "Shut the F up." I was just freaking out. And by the grace of God, I miraculously swept from under him and escaped and ran to my stepson's door and started banging on the door because I knew he would not do anything like that in front of his son. And that's exactly what happened. He stopped instantly.
Shaken, Audrey filed a domestic abuse report against Chris.
I was utterly shocked that he was capable of something so disgusting and violating.
Audrey wanted nothing more than to shut the book on her life with Chris Haney. But Chris wasn't about to let her go that easily.
Chris seemed extremely desperate to get her back at whatever cost.
My neighbor runs to me, she's just screaming.
He had become a monster.
By November of 2009, Audrey Mabry feared her estranged husband, Chris Haney, had become dangerous.
Audrey called me and Chris tried to RAPE me, just like that. I was actually shocked. This is Chris. He loves her. He would never hurt her.
After speaking to the police, I left and went to a friend of mine's and stayed there for 4 days until I could get my own apartment.
Audrey was frightened, but she knew communication with Chris was inevitable.
I felt like I had to talk to him because he had birth certificates and social security cards, and I couldn't sign my lease without those documents.
When Audrey finally made contact a week later, Chris seemed like a different man. He was incredibly contrite and begged for forgiveness.
He continuously expressed that he was very sorry for whatever happened, but that he could not remember what happened. My excuse for him was he drank that night. So I thought maybe that was what caused it.
Chris told Audrey that if she didn't press charges, he would pay child support and he would help her with the monthly bills.
Chris made it very clear to me that if he was to face these charges, that he was absolutely going to lose his job.
Audrey struggled with the decision, but ultimately agreed to Chris's terms and dropped the charges.
I wanted to believe the good in him. I wanted to believe that what he did was fueled by the alcohol.
As the two amicably began coordinating their schedules to take care of the children, Audrey couldn't help but feel she'd made the right choice.
We began taking care of the children as a team, where if we didn't want to wake up the kids in the middle of the night when I came home from work, then I would sleep at his house. And this continued for a couple of weeks.
Audrey felt relieved that the worst seemed to be behind her. She could never have known that her nightmare was just beginning. On November 17th, 2009, Audrey stopped by Chris's house after a jog. She simply wanted to wash up before work. But when Audrey opened the front door, Chris was waiting, and the sight was terrifying.
There he was, with a butcher knife in his hand, and charges at me. I remember turning for the door to open it and him shutting the door with his hand as he's got me scooped up from behind. And the knife caught me on my finger. So I look down to the floor and I see blood dropping to the floor. And in my mind, I'm like, this is very real.
Audrey desperately tried to make sense of the situation, while Chris dragged her into the garage, where he had a blanket laid out on the floor.
And he puts the knife to my throat, and he's trying to rape me from behind. And I'm saying to him, what are you doing? I love you, saying anything to make him stop.
But Chris only responded with more violence, hitting Audrey over the head with a hammer several times.
I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna die right now. He was enraged beyond anything I've ever seen in my life. The image of my children comes to my mind, of them growing up alone. And I start praying, God, just let me live, that's all I want.
Audrey knew she was in a fight for her life, especially when Chris suddenly doused her with gasoline.
He looks at me, very enraged, angry, empty, and he tosses the candle at me. like he's just tossing me the remote. I instantly go up in flames, and I spin up like at the speed of light, run to the main garage door, and I open it just enough for me to run out. And once my feet hit the grass, I dropped like everyone learned in elementary school, stop, drop, and roll. My neighbor runs to me. She's hitting me with her son's jacket, helping to put me out. And she's just screaming, "Oh my God, Audrey, oh my God, oh my God."
As the house went up in flames, the neighbor called 911.
Emergency dispatch. My neighbor was on fire. Your neighbor was on fire? What part of her body was injured? Her arms, she's bleeding, her face and her arms? And I was on fire, and her husband is inside. The house is on fire?
Our best information at the time was that Audrey may not survive. Chris was located by some bystanders just outside of the house in the backyard. He had a laceration to his neck, his wrist, and he also had a puncture wound on his left side.
Audrey and Chris were both airlifted to the nearest hospital. Audrey was almost fatally burned and barely conscious. And as she struggled to live, detectives began trying to shed light on Chris's horrific attack.
He told everybody, "Now I am the monster that she made me out to be."
The message he sent me was, "It's time for you to prove how much you love those kids."
On November 17th, 2009, Audrey Mabry was in intensive care, desperately fighting for her life.
I couldn't believe he did that. I couldn't believe he did that to her, just because he couldn't have her.
When I first arrived at the scene, I didn't know what had happened. The neighbor told us that Chris had set Audrey on fire. I did find out he was one of the persons that was transported to the hospital. So we knew where he was.
Investigators immediately went to question Chris at the hospital, but he refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives discovered Chris owned a van that was not parked at the house.
We located this van about a half a mile away out of view and parked at a community building. That would lead me to believe that this was somewhat premeditated.
They also found several incriminating text messages Chris sent to friends and family just before the attack.
He said, "Now I am the monster that she made me out to be."
The text message he sent me was, "It's time for you to prove how much you love those kids." I thought he was going to kill himself.
By the next day, investigators had enough evidence to place Chris under arrest for attempted murder.
The fact that Christopher had parked his personal vehicle about a half a mile from the incident scene. He had laid a blanket on the floor and used a candle from the bathroom. Those three items alone would indicate to me that this was a hastily devised plan.
It was 6 weeks before Audrey awoke from her medically induced coma. She was shocked to see she had been burned over 80% of her body.
When I looked at myself, I was absolutely devastated and then somehow determined that he was not going to rob me of what he wanted to rob me of. And that became my mission.
In the 3 months that followed, Audrey pushed through excruciating pain to relearn everyday tasks like walking. She also underwent 7 different trauma surgeries and skin grafts. Her main goal was to get back to her children and her life.
There were a lot of dark moments. It took me almost a year to get to a point where I saw a beautiful girl again, but not because she was all made up, but because she was repaired and renewed internally.
On January 24th, 2012, Chris Haney went to trial. He pleaded not guilty.
I was the first witness to go up. He looked me dead in my eye. It felt very surreal. I kept feeling my chest clench, and at one point I felt like I was gonna vomit.
Prosecutors contended that Chris set out to kill Audrey and then himself because he was distraught over losing her. And the jury agreed. Chris was convicted of attempted murder, aggravated battery, and arson. On March 2nd, 2012, Chris Haney was sentenced to life in prison plus 2 30-year terms, just 2 days after his divorce from Audrey was finalized.
When I look back, him being so manipulative and so controlling of my lifelong decisions, that's absolutely a sign of someone who is capable of domestic violence. I believe Chris did what he did because he was a man that felt that he had lost everything. Therefore, he was capable of anything.
Audrey has since moved on with her life, but she still battles the after effects of Chris's attack.
The heat and the sun is an extreme struggle for me. My range of motion is not the same. Being burned is something that is a very long recovery.
Even with her struggles, Audrey has gone back to school. She has also been in a healthy, happy relationship for more than a year.
Despite the horrible things she went through that day, Audrey is definitely more beautiful now than she's ever been. She has a new purpose on life.
My purpose is to give people hope, to show people that no matter what happens to you in life, you must persevere, and you never know your true strength until you're tested.
It begins with a sound that no one remembers clearly anymore. A door closing, or maybe opening. A soft thud in the dark. Something ordinary enough to be ignored, yet heavy enough to echo for decades. Ohio, winter of 1991. The kind of cold that seeps into walls and stays there. The kind that makes breath visible. Makes streets feel empty even when they're not. A quiet town, the sort that believes nothing truly bad can happen because nothing bad ever has. At least not that anyone talks about. Until one night rewrites everything. The missing person report is filed the next morning. Typed words. Flat language. No emotion. Name. Age. Address. Last seen time. A routine form processed by a routine system, handed off to a routine officer who has no idea this piece of paper will follow him for the rest of his career. Cold case. Those two words don't exist yet in the file. Not officially. But they're already there, hovering between the lines. The house is still warm when police arrive. Lights off. No sign of forced entry. No blood. No struggle that leaves a mark big enough to shout. Just absence. Coffee in a mug half finished. A coat hanging by the door. Shoes where they're supposed to be. A life paused mid-sentence. Neighbors say they heard nothing. They always say that. Or they say they heard something, but they're not sure when or what it was or whether it matters. Time blurs memory fast, especially when fear enters the picture. The victim, because that word will eventually replace missing, was known. Not famous. Not powerful. Just familiar. The kind of person whose face blends into the rhythm of the town. Seen at the grocery store. At the gas station. Waved at but rarely stopped. And that's what makes the disappearance hit harder. Because if someone like that can vanish without noise, without witnesses, without a trace, then anyone can. Police search nearby roads first. Then fields. Then wooded areas stripped bare by winter. Helicopters cut lines through the sky, their blades beating time into the cold air. Dogs follow scents that fade into nothing. Every hour that passes thickens the silence. The investigation grows legs, then loses them just as fast. Tips come in. Most go nowhere. Some contradict each other. One points east. Another swears it was west. A late-night caller claims they saw a car, but can't describe the driver. Another remembers a scream, but only after seeing the news. News vans arrive. Headlines sharpen. Words like mysterious and vanish start appearing in bold print. The town reads them over breakfast, then folds the paper away like it might bite. Inside the station, detectives build a timeline out of guesswork and hope. Last confirmed sighting. Last phone call. Last normal moment before the ground drops out. They interview friends, co-workers, family. Each conversation ends the same way, with questions hanging in the air, unanswered, heavy. Something doesn't fit. Everyone feels it. No signs of escape. No money missing. No reason to run. Which leaves only one direction the investigation doesn't want to look. The first week ends with nothing solid. The second week with even less. By the third, the case starts slipping down the priority list quietly without ceremony. Another file on the shelf. Another name waiting for dust. Years pass. The town grows around the absence. New families move in. Kids who were too young to remember grow up hearing fragments of the story, half warning, half myth. Parents lower their voices when the subject comes up. The detectives change. Transfers. Retirements. One of them keeps the file longer than the others, pulling it out late at night, staring at the photos like they might blink. Cold case. Now the words are official. Boxes replace desks. Evidence bags yellow with age. Cassette tapes labeled in fading ink. The past compressed into cardboard. And still nothing. No body. No confession. No arrest. Just a town that learned how to live with a hole in its center. Then years later something shifts. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not the way movies promise. A clerk going through old evidence for digitization pauses. Just for a second. Because something feels wrong. It's small. So small it was overlooked for years. A detail buried under routine, under assumption, under the belief that it didn't matter. A tiny clue. Back in 1991 it was logged, tagged, and set aside. Not dismissed, just deprioritized. Too insignificant. Too ordinary. Now in a different light it breathes again. The clerk flags it. A detective, new, younger, unfamiliar with the emotional weight of the case, takes a look. And suddenly the cold case isn't cold anymore. The town doesn't know yet. The family doesn't know. No headlines scream. No cameras roll. But somewhere in an evidence room, a thread is being pulled. Carefully. Slowly. Because if this tiny detail was misunderstood, then everything else might be too. And if that's true, then Ohio 1991 was never quiet at all. It was just whispering. The house looks smaller now than it did in the photographs. Or maybe the photographs were lying. When the detective steps inside again, years after the last uniform crossed the threshold, the air feels different. Not colder. Not warmer. Just wrong, like a room that remembers something people have forgotten. This is where the timeline fractured. Back in 1991, officers noted the obvious first. Doors locked. Windows intact. No sign of forced entry. The checklist was completed quickly, efficiently, almost mechanically. Nothing screamed emergency. Nothing begged for urgency. But absence doesn't shout. It hums. The living room tells a story no one bothered to read closely. Furniture untouched. Cushions not disturbed. A lamp angled slightly away from where it should be. Dismissed at the time as nothing more than personal habit. No overturned chairs. No broken glass. The kind of scene investigators label clean. And then quietly resent, because clean scenes refuse to cooperate. The kitchen clock stopped at 9:17 p.m. Power outage, maybe. Or someone brushed against it. Or someone wanted time to freeze right there. That detail went into the report. It didn't stand out. Clock stop all the time. Batteristi. But now, decades later, the detective stares at the note like it might blink. 9:17. The coffee mug sits in the same place it did in the original photographs. Not physically, the mug is long gone, but in memory. Half full. No lipstick mark. No visible tremor in the liquid captured by the camera flash. Which means it wasn't dropped. It wasn't abandoned in panic. Who leaves coffee untouched in the middle of the evening? Someone who thought they'd be back in seconds. The coat by the door was winter thick. Heavy. Necessary. Left behind. Shoes lined neatly underneath, as if waiting for their owner to return and step back into routine. People don't leave like that unless they expect to come back. The detective flips through interview transcripts from the first 48 hours. Those early conversations are always the most honest, before memory hardens into something rehearsed. A neighbor mentions a car idling briefly outside. Another swears they heard footsteps but can't place the time. A third says they saw nothing unusual, which in a quiet town might mean more than it sounds like. The statements don't contradict. They overlap without touching. Back then, investigators assumed the victim left willingly, stepped outside for a quick conversation, met someone they trusted, or thought they trusted. Trust is a dangerous thing. It lowers volume. It softens edges. The last confirmed sighting places the victim at a convenience store just before dusk. Grainy security footage shows a familiar figure at the counter. Normal posture. No visible distress. They pay in cash. Exchange a few words with the clerk. Nothing out of place. Except one thing. The detective rewinds the footage again. And again. Zooms in. The victim glances toward the door. Not once but twice before leaving. Not enough to alarm anyone at the time, but enough to register now. People don't look at doors like that unless they're waiting for someone, or worried someone might appear. In 1991, the footage quality was poor. The glance was dismissed as coincidence. Now digitized, enhanced, slowed, it lingers longer than it should. The detective writes one word in the margin of his notes: anticipation. Back at the house, investigators had found no phone messages, no answering machine tape overwritten, no incoming calls logged around the time of disappearance. Another dead end. But phones then were blunt instruments. They didn't remember everything. They forgot easily. The case file mentions a single outgoing call earlier that evening. Short. Less than a minute. The number scribbled hastily. Never fully traced. At the time it led nowhere. A disconnected line. Another shrug. Now the detective circles it in red. Because numbers don't disappear. They wait. He visits the street again. Walks it slowly. Measures distances with his steps. From the front door to the curb. From the curb to where a car might have parked without being noticed. The streetlights cast shadows that bend just enough to hide a figure standing still. In winter, sound carries, but only if you expect to hear it. If someone opened the door voluntarily, stepped outside into the cold, voices low, familiar, no one would think to listen. And if something went wrong fast enough, there would be no time to scream. The original investigators searched nearby woods extensively. Dogs tracked scents that dissolved near the road. That was interpreted as a vehicle involvement. Another assumption filed away. But assumptions age badly. The detective drives the route again. Every turn logged. Every intersection noted. He imagines headlights cutting through darkness. Imagines the victim in the passenger seat, confused but not yet afraid. Fear has a timeline. Doesn't arrive all at once. Witnesses from 1991 are re-interviewed. Some have moved. Some have died. Some remember nothing clearly anymore. But a few details surface, warped by time yet strangely consistent. A neighbor remembers a car with its engine running longer than necessary. Another recalls headlights switching off, then on again. A third remembers thinking much later that they should have looked out the window. Regret is a common witness. It always shows up late. One interview transcript stands out. A passerby reported seeing two people near the house that night. It was written off because the description was vague. Average height, dark clothing, unremarkable. But now the detective notices what wasn't written. The passerby said the second person stayed mostly in shadow. Never stepped fully into the light. Why stay hidden if you're there willingly? The detective flips back to the evidence log. Items collected. Items discarded. Items marked non-relevant. And there it is. A tiny detail. A nothing detail. A line so small it nearly escaped notice again. A partial impression near the curb. Not a footprint, tire residue. A faint mark on the pavement, noted but never cast. Considered environmental. Considered useless. At the time it meant nothing. Now, with decades of forensic advancement and a different understanding of vehicle patterns, it feels heavier. Not all tires leave the same signature. Not all vehicles stop the same way. The detective stares at the scanned photograph, enhances it, sharpens the contrast. Suddenly, the angle of the mark becomes visible. The direction of pressure. The slight curve. Someone braked. Briefly. Deliberately. Not a casual stop. Controlled one. Which means the car wasn't already parked. It arrived. That changes everything. The timeline tightens. The window narrows. The assumption of a voluntary departure collapses. This wasn't wandering. This wasn't escape. This was interruption. Back in 1991, officers believed the victim stepped out and vanished into the dark. Now the story begins to invert. Someone came to them. Someone knew where they lived. Knew when to come. Knew how to keep things quiet. The detective closes the file slowly. He doesn't announce anything yet. Cold cases don't like noise. They retreat when startled. But inside something is shifting. Because once you realize the disappearance didn't begin with the victim leaving, you start asking who arrived. And once you ask that question, the town of Ohio 1991 stops being a place of mystery and starts becoming a crime scene that was never properly understood. The whisper grows louder, and it's no longer asking what happened, it's asking who made it happen. The car is the first thing that finally makes sense. Not the color, not the model, not even the driver, just the fact that it existed at all. For years, the case assumed movement began with the victim. A decision, a step outside, a voluntary moment that went wrong. That belief shaped everything that followed, where police looked who they questioned, what they ignored. But once the tire mark is re-examined, once the angle of braking is understood, the story reverses direction. The movement didn't start inside the house. It stopped there. Which means the first question was never why did they leave. It was who came for them. The detective pulls DMV records from the early 1990s. Back then, databases weren't clean. Files were fragmented, handwritten, sometimes missing altogether. It takes weeks of cross-referencing registrations tied to vehicles known to leave similar braking impressions, weight distribution, axle spacing, tread patterns that were common at the time but rare now. He narrows it down slowly, painfully. The list shrinks to a handful of vehicle types. Mostly sedans. Mostly domestic. Mostly owned by people who lived within a short radius of the house. Proximity matters. It always has. One name appears more than once. Not highlighted. Not flagged. Just present. In utility records. In a witness statement. In a forgotten interview transcript buried deep in the file. A person who lived close enough to know routines. Close enough to pass by unnoticed. Close enough to hear things without meaning to listen. Back in 1991, this person was interviewed briefly. 10 minutes. Maybe less. The notes are thin. Cooperative. Calm. Alibi given. No reason to push further. And that's where the case moved on without them. The detective reads the transcript again. And again. Something about it feels too smooth. Answers come quickly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. As if rehearsed, but rehearsed badly because real memories are messy. They wander. They contradict themselves. This one doesn't. The alibi places the person at home, alone, watching television. No witnesses. No receipts. No calls made or received. Just a statement accepted at face value. In 1991, that was enough. Now it isn't. The detective maps out the person's location relative to the victim's house. Less than a 5-minute drive. 2 minutes if traffic is light. 30 seconds if you're moving fast. The tire mark near the curb suddenly aligns with the distance. The braking pattern matches someone who knows exactly where they're going. And exactly how long they can stop without attracting attention. Someone comfortable. The detective digs deeper. Employment records show the person worked irregular hours at the time. Nights. Early mornings. The kind of schedule that makes being awake at odd hours unremarkable. Neighbors wouldn't question headlights turning on late. Or a car idling briefly. Cell phone records don't exist yet. But landline logs do, or fragments of them. He tracks the disconnected number from the victim's outgoing call earlier that evening. Takes time. Old phone company archives. Paper records stored in basements and forgotten warehouses. Eventually, the number leads somewhere. Not to a stranger. Not to a business. But to a residence. And the address matches the name. The call lasted 47 seconds. Too long for a wrong number. Too short for a casual conversation. What do people say in 47 seconds that changes the course of their night? The detective imagines the call. The tone. The words chosen carefully. A request. Or a warning. Or a suggestion disguised as concern. Can we talk? I need to show you something. Just step outside for a minute. Ordinary language is the most dangerous kind. The person is still alive when the detective reaches out. Older now. Slower. A life layered over whatever existed back then. They agree to talk. Of course they do. People who think they've outrun the past usually do. The interview room is quiet. No mirrors. No raised voices. Just a recorder placed gently between them. The detective keeps his tone neutral. Non-accusatory. Almost friendly. They talk about the town. How it's changed. How quiet it used to be. How everyone knew everyone. Then the detective asks about 1991. There's a pause. Not long. But long enough. The person repeats the same alibi they gave decades earlier. Almost word for word. Same phrasing. Same rhythm. Like a script that's been memorized too well. The detective doesn't interrupt. He lets it play out. Then he asks about the phone call. 47 seconds.
The person blinks.
Just once. I don't remember that, they say. Memory is selective. Fear sharpens it. Guilt edits it. The detective slides a printed record across the table. Yellowed. Faded. Real. The person's hands don't touch it. They don't need to. Because now something else is happening. Something subtle. Their breathing changes. The detective doesn't accuse. He doesn't raise his voice. He simply asks another question. Why did they call you? Silence stretches. The room fills with it. Finally, the person shrugs. We talk sometimes, they say. Everyone did. That's true. And it's meaningless. The detective shifts tactics. He brings up the car. Not the model. Not the tire mark. Just the fact that a vehicle stopped near the house that night. The person leans back slightly. Defensive. Not obvious. Just enough. I don't know anything about that, they say. Another true statement. And another dodge. The interview ends without a confession. Without an outburst. Without anything dramatic. That's how most real turning points look. But the detective walks out knowing something he didn't before. The past has a pulse. He revisits the crime scene photographs with fresh eyes. The lamp angle. The stopped clock. The untouched coffee. All signs of interruption, not departure. He overlays the phone call timeline with the convenience store footage. The glance toward the door. The anticipation. Everything converges around a narrow window. A knock. A voice. A familiar presence. The detective consults a forensic analyst about the tire mark again. Modern software estimates vehicle speed, weight, angle of approach. It's not perfect, but it's enough. The car didn't just stop. It hesitated, as if waiting for someone to appear. Which means the victim likely stepped out willingly. Trusted the person on the other side of the door. Didn't bring a coat because they didn't plan to be gone long. Trust is the final mistake most victims never realize they've made. The detective returns to witness statements that were previously dismissed. One mentions raised voices, brief, muted, unclear. Another recalls a door opening and closing quickly. No screams. No struggle. Which suggests speed. Control. Surprise. The detective begins building a new theory, not to present yet, but to test. A controlled confrontation outside the house. A moment of escalation. A vehicle positioned for immediate departure. If that's true, then the crime wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. And planning leaves patterns. He looks into the person's life after 1991. Moves. Job changes. A sudden relocation within months of the disappearance. Nothing illegal. Nothing overt. Just movement. People who are running rarely sprint. They walk briskly and never look back. The detective knows he's close now. Close enough that the past is starting to resist. Files misplace themselves. Witnesses hesitate. The case pushes back the way old secrets do. But one thing is certain. The tiny clue, the overlooked tire mark, didn't just reopen the case. It reframed it. Because once you realize someone came to that house with intention, every ordinary detail becomes evidence. Every familiar face becomes unfamiliar. And the name that once sat quietly in the file, untouched for decades, is no longer just present. It's central. The cold case isn't cold anymore. It's holding its breath. The confrontation doesn't begin with violence. That's the part people get wrong. It begins with familiarity. A knock that isn't loud enough to alarm. A voice low, controlled, known. A name spoken the way it's always been spoken. Casual, unthreatening, ordinary. The detective imagines it again and again. Not as a single moment, but as a sequence of small decisions that lock together like gears. Inside the house, the victim hears the knock and doesn't freeze. There's no rush of fear. No instinct to hide. Just curiosity. Maybe annoyance. Maybe obligation. The kind of reaction reserved for someone you recognize but didn't expect. They don't put on the coat. They don't grab their shoes. Because this isn't supposed to take long. The door opens. Cold air slips inside, carrying the smell of winter and something metallic underneath. Car exhaust, maybe still warm. The streetlight casts a thin strip of yellow across the threshold. The visitor stays just outside it. Staying in shadow is deliberate. Light reveals too much. The voices stay low. Neighbors will later say they heard something but couldn't make it out. At the time, no one thinks to look. Nothing about the exchange demands attention. The detective studies the stopped clock again. 9:17 p.m. Not the time of the knock, but close. Close enough to mark the moment routine fractured. Words are exchanged. We'll never know exactly which ones. But we know the rhythm of these moments. They begin polite. They always do. I just need a minute. There's something you should know. We need to clear this up. The victim steps outside fully now. The door closes behind them, not slammed, just pulled shut. A sound too soft to register as danger. This is the point of no return. Something shifts in the conversation. Tone tightens. The visitor's posture changes. Familiarity gives way to urgency, then pressure. The detective believes the argument doesn't last long. Less than a minute. Maybe seconds. Fear arrives late, but when it does, it's sharp. The victim realizes too quickly that this isn't a conversation anymore. It's a confrontation. And the street, once familiar, suddenly feels exposed. Too open. Too quiet. They glance toward the house. Toward the door they just closed. And then the car comes into play. The tire mark suggests the vehicle isn't parked casually. It's positioned. Engine running. Lights off or dimmed. Ready. The visitor steps closer. Invades space. Control increases. Words stop being enough. The detective believes there's a threat, but not a weapon. Not yet. Threats don't always need steel. Sometimes they only need knowledge. Secrets. Consequences. The victim hesitates. That hesitation is everything. Because it gives the visitor time. Time to act. Time to escalate. Time to make a decision they've already rehearsed. The detective believes the victim is grabbed. Not violently at first. An arm. A wrist. Something meant to steer, not overpower. Resistance comes instinctively. A brief struggle. Shoes scrape pavement. Breath catches. But winter muffles sound. And fear steals voices. The car door opens. This is where things accelerate. Panic condenses time. The victim understands now that getting into that car means disappearance. They fight harder. The visitor tightens grip. Strength matters less than leverage. The detective studies the witness statements again. The mention of headlights flicking on then off. The sound of an engine revving slightly. All small details. All dismissed before. They matter now. The victim is forced into the car. Or stumbles into it while trying to pull away. The door closes. Not gently. The tire mark near the curb shows pressure, not speed. The car doesn't take off immediately. It waits. Seconds tick by. Maybe the visitor is catching their breath. Maybe they're thinking. Or maybe they're making sure no one saw. Then the car pulls away. No screeching tires. No dramatic acceleration. Just a controlled departure, as if nothing unusual has happened. Back in the house, time has stopped at 9:17. The coffee cools. The coat waits. The silence settles in. The detective believes the drive doesn't last long. The vehicle heads somewhere familiar. Somewhere close. You don't drive far with a living person in your car unless you have to. Proximity again. Always proximity. Something goes wrong during that drive. Or shortly after. Plans unravel. Control slips. The victim fights back in earnest now, fueled by the realization that this isn't a misunderstanding. It's an abduction. The detective doesn't dwell on the details of what follows. He doesn't need to. The evidence suggests escalation. Fear meeting desperation. A situation spiraling faster than intended. By the time the car stops again, the outcome is sealed. Back in 1991, investigators searched fields, woods, riverbanks. They assumed the victim was taken far away, disposed of somewhere remote. That assumption wasted years. Because the detective now believes the opposite. The body, if there ever was one to find, was never far. Crimes committed close to home are bolder. They rely on familiarity, on confidence, on the belief that knowing an area makes you invisible. He returns to maps from the early 90s, old zoning records, vacant lots, properties that have since been developed, places that were empty then but crowded now. One location stands out, not because it's remote but because it isn't. It's ordinary, forgettable, the kind of place people pass every day without looking twice. The detective doesn't dig yet. He doesn't alert anyone. Cold cases punish impatience. Instead, he revisits the suspect. This time, the questions change. He asks about the relationship, about disagreements, about things left unsaid. The suspect's answers tighten, shorten. Irritation bleeds through calm. People can fake innocence. They struggle to fake indifference. The detective mentions the knock, the late-night visit. Doesn't accuse, just observes. The suspect denies it. Quickly. Too quickly. Then comes the smallest slip. A detail volunteered that wasn't asked for. A reference to the weather. To the cold. To the darkness. How would you remember that? The detective asks gently. The suspect freezes. Just for a moment. Because memory betrays those who've rehearsed lies for too long. It remembers what it shouldn't. The interview ends again without confession. Again without drama. But this time something else lingers. Fear. Not of arrest. Of exposure. The detective knows now that the confrontation outside the house wasn't an accident. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a meeting engineered to look harmless until it wasn't. And that means there are preparations he hasn't uncovered yet. Steps taken beforehand. Decisions made days or weeks earlier. Cold cases don't close with a single revelation. They collapse inward piece by piece, until the truth has nowhere left to hide. The night of 1991 is no longer a blank space. It's filling in. With voices. With movement. With a car idling in the dark. And somewhere between the stopped clock and the fading tire mark, the town of Ohio lost more than a person. It lost the illusion that familiarity is safety. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It hides in routine. That's what the detective understands now. Sitting alone with the file spread across the desk, pages layered like sediment. What happened on that winter night didn't begin at the door. It began earlier, quietly, disguised as normal life. Preparation looks like errands. Like schedules. Like watching without appearing to watch. Weeks before the disappearance, nothing in the town registers as unusual. No alarms. No raised voices. No visible conflict. That's why it worked. The most effective plans borrow the shape of everyday life so closely they become invisible. The detective traces the days backward. He starts with work schedules. Time cards. Shift changes. In 1991, everything was handwritten, punched, stamped. Imperfect records, but patterns still emerge. The suspect's hours shift slightly in the weeks before the disappearance. Not drastically. Just enough to create free windows at night. Free time is a luxury for someone planning something. Gas receipts surface next. Not many, but enough. One stands out. Purchased late. Paid in cash. No reason to keep it, but it survived in a box of old financial records forgotten. The location of the gas station matters. It's not on the suspect's usual route. It is, however, near the victim's neighborhood. The detective marks it on the map. Preparation also looks like information gathering. Casual questions asked too often. Conversations that circle the same subjects. People rarely notice when they're giving away pieces of their routine, when they leave for work, when they return, who visits, who doesn't. Trust lubricates access. The detective interviews an old co-worker of the victim. Someone who remembers fragments. Comments made in passing. A sense that someone had been checking in more frequently near the end. Showing concern that felt slightly forced. At the time it meant nothing. Concern is socially acceptable. Suspicion is rude. The detective listens without interruption. He's learned that people reveal more when they think they're reminiscing, not testifying. The co-worker remembers a conversation from days before the disappearance. The victim mentioned a disagreement. Not dramatic. Not alarming. Just uncomfortable. Someone won't let something go, the victim had said. A throwaway line. Sigh. The detective writes it down anyway. Preparation also means rehearsing outcomes. Imagining scenarios. What if they say no? What if someone sees? What if things go wrong? That's where confidence comes from. Not bravery, but repetition in the mind. The suspect's behavior after the disappearance grows louder under scrutiny. In 1991, it blended into grief and confusion. Now it reads differently. They were visible but not too visible. Present at community gatherings. Willing to talk. Willing to help search briefly. Then slowly pulling back. People who know they're innocent often demand answers. People who know too much avoid them. The detective reviews search logs. Who volunteered? Who suggested locations? Who quietly redirected attention elsewhere? One note stands out. The suspect suggested checking a wooded area miles away. It sounded helpful. Logical. It sent resources in the wrong direction. Preparation doesn't end when the plan begins. It adapts. The detective revisits the suspected secondary location. The ordinary place he flagged earlier. Back in 1991 it was empty. Unremarkable. Accessible without attracting attention. Close enough to return from quickly. He studies aerial photographs from the period. Grainy black and white. The land shows signs of disturbance shortly after the disappearance. Not dramatic. Just enough to suggest activity. Construction followed years later. Foundations poured. Ground reshaped. Whatever might have been there is sealed beneath progress. The detective knows he may never recover physical proof. Cold cases rarely offer that mercy. Instead, they offer convergence. Preparation leaves psychological residue. He returns to the suspect again, this time unannounced. Not aggressive. Just present. He asks about life in the early 90s. About stress. About regrets. About choices that linger. The suspect deflects. Changes subjects. Jokes lightly. But the detective notices something new. Relief doesn't surface when the past is discussed. Only tension. Preparation also includes what comes after. Damage control. Alibis repeated until they feel like truth. Stories told so often they overwrite memory. The detective compares early statements to later ones. Tiny discrepancies surface. Not enough to shock. Enough to accumulate. A time remembered slightly differently. A detail added years later that wasn't there before. A certainty growing where uncertainty should have remained. Memory doesn't get sharper with time. Lies do. The detective speaks with someone else now. Someone peripheral. Someone overlooked. A friend of the suspect from back then. Not close. Just adjacent. They remember a late-night visit weeks before the disappearance. The suspect had shown up unexpectedly. Restless. Talking in circles. Fixated on a problem they wouldn't name. At the time it felt like venting. Now it feels like rehearsal. Preparation also means believing you won't get caught. That familiarity will shield you. That the town's quiet will absorb the noise. Ohio in 1991 was good at that. Swallowed things whole. The detective feels the weight of it now. The years lost. The family waiting. The town moving on while something unresolved festered beneath it. He knows he's past the point of neutrality. He's invested. That's dangerous but unavoidable. Cold cases demand obsession. They don't yield to casual interest. The tiny clue, the tire mark, didn't just reopen the case. It illuminated the preparation behind it. The weeks of quiet decisions. The confidence built from being overlooked. Preparation is invisible until it fails. And now, decades later, it is failing. The detective prepares his next move carefully. This isn't about catching someone off guard. It's about tightening a narrative until it collapses under its own weight. He drafts a timeline that begins long before the knock. Long before the stopped clock. It stretches back into conversations, glances, routines, opportunities. When he's done, there are no gaps left big enough to hide in. The past is no longer distant. It's close enough to touch. And the person who once believed preparation made them safe is starting to realize something else. Preparation only works when the future stays quiet. This one didn't. Pressure doesn't arrive all at once. Seeps in. The detective knows this, which is why he doesn't rush. He lets the case breathe just enough for the person at the center of it to feel the change without being able to name it. Cold cases reopen like old wounds, slowly, painfully, with a memory of how they were first ignored. The suspect notices small things first. A police car passing the house twice in one afternoon. A neighbor mentioning that detectives are asking around again. A phone call that doesn't come but should have. People who have lived for decades with a secret develop a sixth sense for disturbance. Silence becomes suspicious. Routine turns brittle. The detective applies pressure by doing very little. He recontacts witnesses, not aggressively, not publicly. One by one. Conversations that ripple outward. Each person tells someone else. The town hums softly with speculation, the way it did in 1991, but with a different undertone now. This time the past isn't buried. It's resurfacing. The suspect's story has survived because it never had to change. It sat untouched, protected by time and indifference. Now it's being handled again, and every handling leaves fingerprints. The detective invites the suspect in once more. Not for an interrogation, for a conversation. They sit across from each other, older now, the space between them crowded with years. The recorder is visible. That's intentional. Transparency can be unsettling. The detective starts somewhere harmless. Childhood. Work. How life took turns no one expected. The suspect relaxes slightly. Nostalgia is safe ground. Then the detective shifts. He doesn't accuse. He narrates. He describes the night in 1991, not as a theory, not as an allegation, but as a sequence of neutral observations. A knock. A short conversation. A car idling. A door closing. A tire mark near the curb. The suspect listens, face unreadable. The detective continues, calmly, deliberately. He talks about preparation. About how plans often masquerade as routine. About how people convince themselves they're invisible. You'd be surprised, he says, how often the truth isn't hidden. It's just mislabeled. The suspect swallows. Pressure works best when it sounds like understanding. The detective brings up the phone call. 47 seconds. He doesn't ask why it happened. He asks what it meant. Meaning is harder to deny than action. The suspect shrugs again. The gesture is smaller now. Tighter. I don't remember, they say. That's okay, the detective replies. Memory fills in gaps when it needs to. The suspect stiffens. They know what that implies. The detective introduces a new element. Not evidence, not yet. Person. Someone who remembered a late-night visit. Someone who remembered restlessness. Anxiety. Words spoken too often to be casual. The suspect's jaw tightens. The mask doesn't slip. Cracks. Pressure also comes from time itself. The detective lets silence stretch. Not to intimidate, but to allow the suspect's own thoughts to get loud. People confess first to themselves. The suspect speaks again, faster now. Explaining. Contextualizing. Rationalizing. They talk about misunderstandings. About how things get exaggerated over years. About how rumors grow legs. The detective nods. He doesn't interrupt. He lets the narrative expand until it begins to contradict itself. Then he asks a simple question. Why did you go there that night? The suspect freezes. It's subtle, but it's there. Because this time the question isn't hypothetical. It's anchored. It assumes presence. It assumes action. I didn't, the suspect says quickly. Too quickly. The detective doesn't correct them. He doesn't need to. The denial hangs there. Heavier than an accusation. Pressure is cumulative. It doesn't need force. It needs consistency. The detective ends the interview politely. Thanks the suspect for their time. Stands. Leaves. Outside, winter has returned, though decades have passed. The air feels the same. Cold. Expectant. The suspect watches from the window. That night, the suspect doesn't sleep. The detective knows because patterns repeat. People under pressure revisit the past. They check their stories. They call old friends. They drink. Or they don't. They pace. They rehearse. The detective waits. A week later, he makes his next move. He contacts the prosecutor, not to file charges but to discuss options. Without a body, without direct physical evidence, the case will hinge on narrative integrity, on contradictions, on motive, on opportunity, on pressure. The prosecutor listens carefully, asks the right questions, expresses concern but also interest. Cold cases live or die in that space. The detective tightens the net again. He requests permission to search the ordinary place, the one sealed by development. Not to dig, just to document, to photograph, to measure, to establish presence. The request alone sends a message. The suspect hears about it within days. Pressure spikes. They call the detective. Not angry, not accusatory, just uneasy. "I've been thinking," they say, "about that night." That sentence is the hinge. The detective listens. The suspect doesn't confess. Not yet. They talk around the truth. They mention an argument, admit to being upset, admit to wanting to clear things up, still deny being there, still deny involvement. But denial now carries weight. Pressure also works by narrowing options. The suspect realizes that the story they've told for decades no longer fits the evidence being assembled. Each new detail constrains the next lie. The detective introduces one final element: the tire mark. He explains it clinically: braking pressure, vehicle alignment, the likelihood that the driver knew exactly where they were stopping. The suspect interrupts for the first time. "That doesn't mean anything," they say. The detective looks at them steadily. "It means someone planned to be there." Silence. The suspect's breathing quickens. The room feels smaller. Pressure is now visible. The detective doesn't push further. He doesn't need to. He's learned something more important than a confession. He's learned where the fracture is. People break where they prepared the least. The detective leaves again. Days pass. Then weeks. The suspect's behavior changes. They withdraw. Stop answering calls. Cancel plans. The town notices. Pressure spreads outward, touching everything. The detective prepares his final approach. Not an interrogation, but a presentation. A timeline laid out so cleanly that denial becomes exhausting. He rehearses it alone in his office. Every word measured. Every pause intentional. Because when pressure peaks, it has to land somewhere. And the detective knows this. The truth doesn't always emerge in a courtroom. Sometimes it surfaces in a quiet room, in a voice that finally runs out of lies. The past is close now. Close enough to breathe. And the person who once believed preparation would protect them is discovering the final flaw in that belief. Preparation doesn't account for conscience. And conscience, once awakened, is louder than any knock at the door. The breaking point doesn't look like movies promise. There's no shouting. No slammed feasts. No sudden confession delivered in a single cinematic breath. It looks like exhaustion. The suspect arrives unannounced on a gray morning that feels too heavy for the season. They sit in the waiting area longer than necessary, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing. When the detective finally appears, there's relief in the suspect's face. An almost imperceptible release, like someone who has been holding a weight too long. They ask for water. They ask if the recorder is on. They ask if this conversation is just between us. The detective answers carefully. He explains the limits, the rules, the reality. Truth has boundaries now. They move to the interview room. Same table, same chairs, same recorder. But the atmosphere has shifted. The suspect doesn't lean back this time. They lean forward, elbows on the table, shoulders rounded, as if trying to make themselves smaller. The detective doesn't start with questions. He starts with time. 33 years, he says softly. That's a long time to carry anything. The suspect nods. Once. The silence stretches, thick and pressing. This is the silence that comes after resistance has burned itself out. The silence where lies no longer feel sturdy enough to stand on. I didn't mean for it to go like that, the suspect says. It's not a confession yet. But it's no longer denial. The detective doesn't interrupt. He doesn't clarify. He lets the words sit, lets them echo against the walls. The suspect rubs their hands together. The motion is automatic, self-soothing. I just wanted to talk. They continue. That's all it was supposed to be. The detective nods again. Encouragement without agreement. The suspect's voice trembles slightly now, not with fear of punishment, but with the weight of memory finally allowed to surface. They talk about resentment, about feeling ignored, about believing they deserved answers that never came, emotions that felt justified at the time, emotions that grew louder in the quiet. I knew their routine, the suspect admits. Everyone did. Routine again. The word returns like a ghost. They describe the call, the 47 seconds, the careful choice of words. Nothing threatening, nothing that would raise suspicion, just enough urgency to bring someone to the door without a coat. I didn't think anyone would notice, they say. It was late. It was cold. The detective hears the subtext. Confidence, familiarity, control. The suspect's gaze drops to the table. When they stepped outside, they looked confused, the suspect says. Not scared, just surprised. The detective's chest tightens, but his voice remains even. What happened next? The suspect swallows hard. I said things I shouldn't have said. They whisper. Things I can't take back. The confrontation outside the house unfolds in fragments now. Not as a clean sequence but as flashes. Raised voices. Accusations. The moment when words stop working. I grabbed them, the suspect says, just to stop them from walking away. That sentence lands heavily. The suspect closes their eyes. I didn't plan to hurt them, they insist. I swear. I just needed them to listen. Need is a dangerous word. It excuses too much. The detective lets the suspect talk. This isn't the time to challenge details. It's the time to let the dam crack. They describe the car. The door opening. Panic flooding in too late. The realization that control was slipping faster than expected. I didn't know what else to do, the suspect says. Everything happened so fast. The detective hears the pattern he's heard in other cases. The moment where responsibility dissolves into chaos. Where choice becomes reaction. The suspect's voice breaks. They tried to get away, they say. I didn't think they were that strong. Strength doesn't come from muscles in moments like that. Comes from terror. The suspect doesn't describe the rest in detail. They don't need to. The detective doesn't ask them to. He doesn't want to cross the line between truth-seeking and unnecessary cruelty. But the outcome is clear. I panicked, the suspect says. I didn't know what to do. The drive. The second stop. The ordinary place. The one that once blended into the landscape. I thought if I just fixed it, they say, voice barely audible, everything would go back to normal. That's the lie people tell themselves in the aftermath of irreversible acts. Normal is already gone. The detective asks the question that has waited decades to be asked. Where? The suspect hesitates. Not because they don't know, but because saying it out loud makes it real in a way memory never did. They give the location. It's exactly where the detective expected. Progress covers it now. Concrete. Buildings. Life layered over silence. The suspect slumps back in the chair, drained. The confession hasn't brought relief. It rarely does. It brings gravity. The detective stops the recorder. For a moment, neither of them moves. Outside, the world continues. Cars pass. People walk by, unaware that something long buried has just surfaced. The detective explains what happens next. Legal steps. Procedures. Consequences. He does it plainly. Without judgment. Without comfort. The suspect listens numbly. I never thought they'd keep looking, they say quietly. The detective meets their eyes. Someone always does. The arrest doesn't happen immediately. Paperwork takes time. Warrants take time. The system moves slower than guilt, but it moves. News breaks cautiously. Not with celebration. Not with triumph. With restraint. Ohio 1991 cold case closed. The headline spreads. Shock ripples through the town. People who thought the story belonged to the past realize it's been living beside them all along. The family is notified privately. There are no words that fit a moment like that. Closure is a myth. What they receive instead is certainty, and certainty cuts both ways. The detective returns home late that night. He sits in the dark for a long time, thinking about the stopped clock. About the coffee that never cooled fast enough to matter. About how small details can carry the weight of decades. The case is closed on paper. But in the town, in the house, in the quiet spaces where routine once lived, echoes remain. Cold cases don't end. They settle. And sometimes all it takes to change everything is one tiny clue. Waiting patiently for someone willing to listen. The first thing the town feels is not relief. It's vertigo. Because for 33 years the story lived in a safe place, back then, in that winter, in that other era when people still smoked in diners and paid with cash and believed locks meant something. The case became a cautionary tale. A whispered warning. A headline folded and stored away. It belonged to history. And then overnight, history walks back in wearing a familiar face. The news doesn't break like a celebration. It breaks like a crack in glass, thin at first, then spreading faster than anyone can stop. Ohio 1991 cold case closed. Those words land on breakfast tables, on phone screens, on radio stations running the same sentence every hour as if repetition might make it easier to understand. The anchor's voice stays professional, but there's something else beneath it. Disbelief. A cold case doesn't just close. It reopens the town. At the grocery store, people stop mid-aisle, staring at each other over carts. At the gas station, strangers speak in murmurs, comparing fragments of memory like they're trading pieces of a broken mirror. I knew them. I waved to them. They came to my barbecue. No, that can't be right. The suspect's name spreads faster than the facts. That's how it always goes. Names are simple. Truth is slow. Some people reject it immediately. They cling to the image they've carried for decades. A normal person, a neighbor, a familiar routine. They say the detective must be wrong. They say the confession must have been coerced. They say anything that keeps the town from having to admit it lived beside a secret. Others believe instantly because they've always felt it. A discomfort they couldn't justify. A memory they never said out loud. That one time the suspect got angry too quickly, too sharply, and everyone laughed it off. That one time they avoided a question with a smile that didn't reach their eyes. When a truth is revealed, it doesn't arrive alone. It drags every half-memory behind it. The detective stays out of the spotlight. That's intentional. He's seen cases collapse when ego gets too loud. He lets the prosecutor speak. Lets the system do what it's designed to do. But even the system hesitates when the ground itself has changed. The location the suspect gave, ordinary back then, sealed now, sits under new life. Buildings. Parking lots. Concrete that doesn't care what's beneath it. The detective stands at the edge of it with a small team, staring at the place where the past has been paved over. It's not dramatic. There are no storm clouds. No cinematic Sander. Just the sound of traffic. The prosecutor wants certainty. The defense will demand proof. A confession is powerful, but it isn't always enough. The truth needs structure. It needs support. And sometimes it needs the ground to speak. They bring in specialists. Not with shovels first, but with instruments. Radar. Mapping. Careful measurements. The detective watches as screens flicker with shapes and anomalies that might be nothing, or might be everything. The town watches too from a distance. News cameras line up at the perimeter, lenses pointed toward the most ordinary patch of asphalt anyone has ever seen. Reporters speak into microphones, voices hushed as if the air itself could hear them. The detective hates the spectacle, but he understands it. People need to see the past being handled with real hands. The family is kept separate from the noise, protected as much as possible. They've lived with uncertainty so long that certainty feels like a new kind of pain. Not sharper, just different, solid, undeniable, no longer negotiable. The detective meets them privately. No cameras. No recorders. No dramatic statements. Just a room and the weight of 33 years pressing down. He tells them what he can. He doesn't embellish. He doesn't soften it with false comfort. He has learned that families don't want stories. They want truth. And truth, even when it finally arrives, doesn't restore what was taken. It rearranges the wound. One family member asks a question that is not really a question. Why now? The detective thinks of the evidence clerk, the tiny overlooked detail, the tire mark that waited patiently in a forgotten photograph. He thinks of how close this case came to staying silent forever. Because something small refused to stay small, he says. Outside the room, the town continues to churn. Old friends of the suspect are questioned again. Some cooperate. Some lash out. Some collapse under the shame of realizing they defended someone they never truly knew. The suspect's house becomes a landmark overnight. People drive by slowly staring. A few leave notes. Most don't. The windows stay dark. Inside the station, the detective reviews the confession again, listening for gaps, for places where memory might be shaped by self-protection. The suspect's voice on tape is thinner than in person. The recorder captures every breath, every hesitation, every quiet phrase meant to minimize what can't be minimized. I didn't mean for it to go like that. Intent is always the last refuge. The prosecutor builds the case carefully. The timeline is laid out like a bridge. The phone call, the knock, the vehicle, the second location. Witness statements pulled from 1991 are brought back into the light. Each one gains new meaning when placed in the correct frame. A neighbor's vague memory becomes a timestamp. A passerby's shadowed figure becomes confirmation. A stopped clock becomes the moment the world changed. The defense prepares their own story as they always do. They talk about coerced confession, about faded memories, about the impossibility of proving anything after decades. They don't mention the tire mark. They don't mention the call. Because those are the bones of the case now. And bones don't care how much time has passed. Still, the detective knows the hardest part isn't the courtroom. It's the town. Because towns like this survive on the belief that danger comes from outside. From strangers. From highways. From nameless figures in the dark. This case ruins that belief. Says the opposite. Says the danger had a name. A routine. A familiar face. The detective watches the community react the way people react when their sense of safety is violated. Some grow angry. Some grow paranoid. Some become quiet and cautious, as if the air itself can deceive them. Local schools send home letters. Parents talk to kids in new tones. Doors are checked twice. Neighborhood watch groups appear again. Older members suddenly energized by fear they thought they outgrew. Fear is contagious. So is truth. Then the instruments at the site register something that forces everyone to breathe differently. An irregularity beneath the surface. A void. A disturbance. It isn't confirmation, not yet, but it's enough for the prosecutor to request further action. The detective stands at the edge again as crews prepare to remove sections of concrete. The process is slow, careful, respectful because they are no longer just excavating earth. They are excavating time. The first piece of pavement comes up with a groan. Underneath is soil that hasn't seen daylight since before some of the reporters were born. The smell rises, damp, old, neutral. Dirt doesn't carry emotion. Humans assign it. The detective watches, hands in pockets, jaw tight. He's solved cases before. He's made arrests. He's stood in courtrooms and heard verdicts. But this feels different. Because the town is watching the past come back in physical form. And physical form is harder to deny than headlines. The family is told before the cameras are. That matters. The detective insists. Dignity is the one thing a cold case can still give. When the call comes, when the specialists say they have found something consistent with what the suspect described, the detective doesn't feel victory. He feels gravity. He thinks of the coffee mug again, the coat, the shoes lined up, waiting faithfully for someone who never returned. He thinks of the victim stepping out into the cold, believing a conversation would end in minutes. He thinks of the suspect believing the ground would hold the secret forever. Concrete, soil, time. None of them are loyal. That night, the detective drives through town. The streets are familiar, but they feel altered. As if the truth has shifted the angles of every building. He passes the victim's old neighborhood. The house looks ordinary again, which is somehow worse. Ordinary is where this began. At a stoplight, he looks at the clock on the dashboard. For a moment he sees 9:17 in his mind, frozen, persistent, refusing to let the story fade. Cold cases don't haunt because they're unsolved. They haunt because they remind us how thin routine really is. And now, with the ground opened and the confession on tape and the town shaken awake, the case is no longer a question. It's an answer. But answers have a cost. They force people to look at what they avoided. They force the community to admit what it missed. They force the family to grieve in a new tense, no longer maybe, now is. The detective knows part of the story is still missing. Not the what, not the who, the why. And the why is always where the real horror lives, not in violence but in the ordinary emotions that grow into something unforgivable. That is what comes next. The courthouse doesn't look like justice. It looks like paperwork. Gray stone. Fluorescent light. A hallway that smells faintly of old carpet and coffee that's been reheated too many times. People move through security with the same routine motions they use at airports. Empty pockets, step through, keep walking. As if what happens inside is just another errand. But today the building feels different. Today the town is here. Not all at once, not as a crowd with banners or noise, but in clusters, quiet groups, faces pulled tight, eyes scanning for someone to recognize and someone to avoid. The kind of gathering where nobody knows what to say because every sentence sounds wrong. Cold case. Closed. Two words that should feel final but instead feel like the start of another kind of nightmare. The detective arrives early. He takes the back-end trance, avoids cameras, avoids the hungry look reporters get when they sense a soundbite hiding inside a person's face. He isn't here to perform. He's here to watch the past become public. In the courtroom, wood panels absorb voices. The judge's bench rises above everything like a warning. The flags are still. The air is too dry. The victim's family sits together. Not touching but close enough to share the same silence. Their expressions aren't anger, not exactly, not the Hollywood kind. They carry something older than anger. The fatigue of decades spent living with an unanswered question. The suspect is brought in. Older now. Smaller in presence than in memory. The town sees them and experiences a strange disorientation, because the face is familiar, but the context is poisonous. Someone in the gallery whispers, "I can't believe it." Someone else whispers, "I always knew." Both sentences are lies in different directions. The prosecutor stands, voice steady, and begins shaping the case into a story the court can hold. Not a story meant for emotion but one meant for structure. Dates, times, calls, witness statements. The language is cold because courts demand coldness. But the content isn't. The prosecutor speaks of the phone call, 47 seconds that led to a knock, a conversation, a car that arrived positioned to leave. The prosecutor doesn't describe what happened after in graphic terms. They don't need to. The courtroom doesn't need gore to understand loss. They need clarity. The defense rises next, smooth and cautious. They talk about time, about memory, about how decades can distort perception, about how evidence fades, about how a confession isn't always what it seems. They say the words carefully, like walking across thin ice. Coercion, misremembering, pressure. They avoid one phrase, tire mark, because the tire mark is the needle in the haystack, the tiny clue that refused to die, the one thing that didn't rely on human memory, the one thing that sat in a photograph and waited for someone to take it seriously. The detective feels his jaw tighten, not from anger, but from the raw familiarity of how truth gets challenged when it finally steps into the light. When it's time for testimony, the detective takes the stand. He raises his hand, swears, sits. He looks out at the gallery and sees the town's faces like a wall. People he has passed in grocery aisles. People who have stood in line behind him at coffee shops. Ordinary faces carrying extraordinary attention. He speaks slowly, cleanly. He describes how the cold case was reopened. He talks about evidence review. He explains in plain language why small details matter. He never says, "I knew." He never says, "I felt." He says, "I observed. I documented. I verified." Because the courtroom isn't built for intuition. It's built for steps. Then he gets to the moment the case shifted. The tire mark. The braking angle. The vehicle presence. He explains how the assumption of voluntary departure collapsed. How the evidence suggested someone arrived controlled, prepared. How that reframe guided everything that followed. He watches the jurors' faces change. Not dramatically, but subtly, like people adjusting their posture when they realize they're hearing something that can't be easily dismissed. A tiny clue changes everything. Then the prosecutor introduces the confession. Not theatrically. Not with a flourish. Just the cold fact of it, recorded. Verified. Consistent with known details. consistent with the call logs, witness statements, and location described. The recording plays. The room becomes smaller. The suspect's voice fills the space, older, worn, brittle. It doesn't sound like a monster. That's the problem. Sounds like a person. And people are harder to hate cleanly than monsters. I didn't mean for it to go like that. The sentence lands on the jury like a weight. The victim's family holds their breath. The town's faces harden. Someone in the back shifts as if trying to escape the sound without leaving. The defense objects to certain portions. The judge overrules some, sustains others. The legal machinery keeps turning, indifferent to the emotional wreckage it creates. The prosecutor calls an expert witness, someone who can translate patterns into explanation. They speak about how plans often appear as ordinary behavior, how late-night calls and controlled vehicle stops fit known structures of escalation, how proximity is a common thread in cases involving familiarity. Familiarity, the expert says, is not safety. The detective watches the town absorb that sentence. Because it isn't a legal argument. It's a cultural wound. Then the prosecutor moves toward the motive. This is where the room grows tense in a different way because motive is not always clean. It rarely fits into one word. It is usually a stew of small emotions, resentment, insecurity, obsession with control, heated slowly until it boils over. The prosecutor doesn't romanticize it. They don't psychologize for drama. They present it as it appears in records and testimony. Conflict, fixation, and a refusal to let something go. The phrase returns like a ghost from earlier. Someone won't let something go. The defense tries to puncture it. They argue that motive is speculation, that interpersonal tension exists everywhere, that it doesn't prove guilt. And in a way they're right. Motive doesn't prove action. But motive explains why the action made sense to the person who did it. It shows the shape of the mind that planned a knock at 9 p.m. and believed it would remain invisible forever. The detective hears the prosecutor's closing words and feels the air tighten. This case is not about the impossibility of solving the past, the prosecutor says. It's about the cost of ignoring small truths. Small truths. A tire mark. A short phone call. A glance at a door. A clock that stopped. The defense delivers their own closing, measured and careful, emphasizing doubt. They lean into time, into the idea that after decades, certainty is dangerous. They imply that the suspect may have confessed under strain, under psychological pressure, under fear of being blamed. They don't explain why the confession aligns with the call record. They don't explain why the location matches the anomaly under the pavement. They don't explain why denial lasted until the net tightened. Because those explanations would require a different story. And they don't have one. When the jury leaves to deliberate, the courtroom exhales. People shift, whisper, stand, sit again. Time becomes thick. Minutes stretch and warp. The victim's family sits as still as stone. The detective doesn't pray. He doesn't bargain. He has learned not to. He watches the clock on the wall tick forward and thinks of the one that stopped at 9:17. He thinks about how time behaves differently in cold cases. It moves for everyone else. It stays still for the people left behind. The jury returns. Everyone stands. The foreperson's voice is clear, trembling only at the edges. Guilty. The word hits the room like a door closing. Not a slam. A final latch. The victim's family doesn't cheer. There is no moment of triumph. One of them closes their eyes and lowers their head, as if hearing guilty finally makes the decades real in a way missing never did. The suspect's shoulders sag. The defense attorney places a hand briefly on their arm. A gesture of professionalism more than comfort. Outside, cameras wait like predators. Reporters speak into microphones, repeating the same phrases the public needs to hear. Cold case closed. Justice after decades. Community shocked. But the detective knows what those headlines don't capture. They don't capture the way the town feels split in two before and after. They don't capture the way trust fractures and doesn't fully repair. They don't capture the quiet realization that evil doesn't always arrive masked. Sometimes it arrives with a familiar knock and a voice you recognize. After the verdict, the detective returns to the office. He places the file back on his desk, then closes it. The sound is soft, ordinary, but in his mind it echoes. Because the verdict isn't the end. Not emotionally. Not culturally. Not for the family, not for the town. Not even for the detective who spent years listening to silence until it finally spoke. There is still sentencing. There are still statements. There is still the question that haunts every solved cold case. What do you do with truth once you finally have it? The detective looks at the clock. The hands keep moving. This time doesn't stop. And somehow that feels like the strangest part of all. The word guilty doesn't end anything. It just changes the shape of the waiting. After the verdict, the courthouse empties in slow waves. People drift into hallways, into cold daylight, into microphones and camera lights that turn grief into sound bites. Reporters speak in practice tones, repeating the same phrases like charms meant to make the outcome feel clean. Justice. Closure. Finally. But inside the victim's family, nothing closes. Something simply locks into place. A truth hardens. The years stop being a fog of possibilities and become one brutal line that can't be redrawn. Sentencing is scheduled weeks later. Time for the rest of the town moves normally again. Lunch breaks. School drop-offs. Holiday plans. The case slips into conversation the way storms slip into memory, still talked about but no longer immediate. For the family, time changes texture. Every day carries the same thought. Now we say it out loud. Now the truth is no longer whispered. Now the person who vanished in 1991 is spoken of in a courtroom where rules demand order, even when emotions refuse it. The detective returns to work like it's routine. That's what he tells himself. But he notices small signs of disturbance everywhere. People in the station speak softer. Officers glance up when he passes, as if he's carrying something contagious. The file sits on his desk like a weight that won't lighten even after the verdict. He catches himself rereading details he already knows by heart. The stopped clock. The 47 seconds. The tire mark. It's not about confirmation anymore. It's about disbelief. About how a life can be interrupted so quietly, and how the interruption can echo for decades without anyone hearing it clearly. The town is divided in a way no one wanted to admit at first. There are those who say they always suspected the suspect. They speak with certainty now, rewriting their own memories to feel safer. And there are those who defend the suspect even after conviction, because the alternative is too terrifying. That familiarity is not protection. That routine is not armor. At diners and barbershops, conversations break into halves. One table says the police did their job. Another says the police ruined an innocent person. Some say the confession was enough. Others say it's impossible to be sure after so long. The detective doesn't argue with them. He knows certainty is a luxury most people can't afford emotionally. If they accept the truth fully, they have to accept what it implies about their world. A town doesn't just lose a person in a cold case. It loses innocence. On the morning of sentencing, the courthouse feels different again. Not tense like a verdict day. More solemn. More final. The air is colder even indoors, as if the building itself remembers that it was designed not just for law, but for consequences. The victim's family arrives early. They sit in the same place. They wear the same tired expressions. But something has changed. This time they aren't waiting to be believed. This time they are waiting to be heard. The suspect is brought in. They look smaller than before, the posture of someone who has run out of distance. Their eyes scan the room, not searching for allies, but for exits that no longer exist. Behind them, deputies stand with practiced stillness. The judge enters. Everyone rises. The courtroom breathes together. A collective inhale like the town is bracing for impact. The prosecutor speaks first. They summarize the conviction and recommend a sentence. Their tone is firm but not theatrical. They don't need drama. The facts already carry enough weight. They talk about the decades lost, the harm done not only to one life but to an entire community forced to live with uncertainty. Then they turn toward the family. Victim impact statements, the judge says. The phrase sounds clinical, but what follows is anything but. A family member stands. Their hands shake slightly, paper trembling under the pressure of what it contains. They don't look at the suspect at first. They look at the judge, then out toward the back of the courtroom, then down at their own words like they're afraid to unleash them. When they finally speak, the voice is steady in a way only long suffering can produce. They talk about the first week after the disappearance, how every phone ring felt like oxygen, how every knock at the door made their heart leap, how every hour stretched thick and cruel, because hope is heavy when it has nowhere to land. They talk about birthdays that arrived without answers, holidays that became rituals of absence, the way the family learned to celebrate with a hole in the table that no one could fill, the way they became experts at pretending to be normal in front of strangers. They talk about the rumors, the theories, the strangers who offered help that felt like spectacle, the neighbors who avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty but out of discomfort, the way the town moved on while they stayed trapped in 1991. Then they look at the suspect, and the courtroom changes temperature. Their words are not screamed. They don't need to be. They're sharper than shouting because they are measured, deliberate, and undeniable. "You didn't just take them," the family member says. "You took the future we were supposed to have. You took the right to live without imagining the worst." They pause, swallowing, and the silence is louder than any sentence. "I want you to know," they continue, "that every year you woke up and lived your life, we woke up and lived inside a question. A question. That's what cold cases do. They turn lives into punctuation marks." Another family member speaks next. Their voice is different, less controlled, more raw, but still not graphic. They talk about the way grief mutated over time, how it didn't fade but changed forms, how anger flared and cooled and flared again, because there was nowhere to put it. They don't say they forgive. They don't say they hate. They say something simpler, something more devastating. "I just want the truth to stop moving." The detective feels that sentence settle deep. Because that's the thing, truth in a cold case shifts like smoke until the moment it becomes solid, until someone touches it and burns. When the family sits, the courtroom is quiet in a way that feels fragile. People blink rapidly, as if blinking can hold back what they're feeling. Even the suspect looks altered, not remorseful in a clean way, but shaken, like someone hearing the echo of their own actions for the first time. Then it's the defense's turn. They ask for leniency. They talk about age, about the passage of time, about the suspect's life lived since. They use words like regret, and remorse, and responsibility. Careful, polished words designed to soften edges. The judge listens, face unreadable. Then the judge speaks. The sentence is delivered without flourish. Courts don't punish with drama. They punish with finality. The judge acknowledges the decades of uncertainty, the confession, the impact, the need for accountability. The words fall like stones. When the sentence is announced, there is no cheer. There is no sense of victory. There is only a kind of quiet acceptance, like the family has been holding a breath for 33 years and is finally allowed to exhale, only to realize exhaling doesn't give air back to the past. The suspect doesn't collapse. They don't lash out. They simply close their eyes for a moment, as if picturing the life they believed would remain untouched forever. Then they are led away. A door opens. A door closes. And for a second, the detective hears that imagined sound again, the one from 1991. The soft latch. The ordinary click that changed everything. Outside the courthouse, cameras flash. Reporters reach for statements. The prosecutor speaks briefly. The family is shielded by friends and advocates, guided away from the noise. Some in the crowd cry. Some look blank. Some look angry. Everyone looks changed. The detective doesn't speak to the press. He walks to his car, hands numb against the winter air, and sits behind the wheel without turning the key. He watches people move past the windshield, their lives continuing, as if continuity is guaranteed. He thinks about the tiny clue again. That tire mark didn't solve the case by itself. It didn't shout a name. It didn't carry a confession inside it. It simply refused to be meaningless. It waited until someone had the patience, and the humility, to believe that small things can hold large truths. That's the lesson the town doesn't want but can't unlearn. Evil doesn't always arrive with a weapon in hand. Sometimes it arrives with a familiar voice and a request for just a minute. The detective drives through the town again, passing places that now feel haunted not by ghosts but by realization. The grocery store, the gas station, the street where the house still stands. Ordinary buildings made uncanny by context. He stops near the old neighborhood and looks down the street. He imagines the victim stepping out, coat left behind, coffee cooling inside. He imagines the moment of recognition turning into confusion, then fear. He imagines how fast life can tilt. And he thinks about all the years in between, the birthdays, the rumors, the silence, the file-gathering dust. A cold case doesn't just steal a person. It steals time. That night, the detective returns home and sits in the dark again. He doesn't feel proud. Pride doesn't fit here. He feels something closer to reverence for the fragile chain of events that finally brought truth into the open. An evidence clerk pausing. A photograph re-examined. A mark on pavement that once seemed like nothing. One tiny clue. He looks at the clock on his wall. The hands keep moving. And he knows the final part of this story isn't in the courthouse or the sentence, or the headlines that will fade within weeks. The final part is the aftershock. The way the town will carry this truth. The way the family will live with certainty. The way the detective will hear the word 917 in his mind for years, even as time insists on marching forward. Because the case may be closed. But the echo is not. The town expects the story to end after sentencing. That's what people are taught to believe, that a gavel falling is a curtain closing, that a judge's words turn chaos into order, that a case number stamped closed is a spell strong enough to silence the past. But the past doesn't care about paperwork. It lives in the places where routine used to feel safe. It lives in the way a neighbor pauses at a doorway for half a second longer than before, listening to the quiet like it might contain footsteps. It lives in the way headlights passing through blinds at night suddenly feel personal, invasive, like someone watching. It lives in the way the town's oldest residents begin speaking softer, not because they're afraid of noise, but because they realize how much can happen without it. In the days after the sentence, the news cycle moves on. New headlines replace old ones. Another story rises. Another outrage. Another tragedy. That's how the world protects itself. By stacking disasters until each one becomes a thin layer, manageable, distant. But in Ohio, 1991 never fully leaves. People still drive the same roads. They still buy milk at the same store. Kids still run down the same sidewalks. Yet something intangible has shifted, like a compass that no longer points where it used to. The house remains. It always does. It stands quietly in the neighborhood, siding weathered, windows reflecting the sky like nothing ever happened inside. Some families avoid the block entirely. Others slow down as they pass, eyes flicking toward the front door, toward the space where the knock came from, where the cold air slid into a life that assumed it would continue. The house looks normal. That's what makes it unbearable. Normal was the disguise. The detective returns to the station and finds the file no longer feels like a mystery. It feels like a scar, sealed over but sensitive to pressure. He opens it one last time, not because he needs answers, but because he needs to see the entire arc of it laid out, beginning to end like a map of a storm that has already passed through. The pages are worn. The ink is faded. The photographs are still. A coffee mug captured by a flash, frozen in a moment that didn't know it was about to become history. A coat hanging by the door like a promise. A clock stopped at 9:17. Hands locked in place as if time itself refused to witness what happened next. He thinks of how easily it could have stayed that way. One small detail overlooked. One photograph never re-examined. One quiet decision to let the file gather dust. The case didn't survive because it was loud. It survived because it was stubborn. Because something in it didn't fit, and the wrongness of that refused to dissolve completely, even as years stacked on top of it like snowfall. The detective drives past the old excavation site again. The pavement has been repaired. The work crews are gone. The cameras have moved on. People park there now without thinking about what lies beneath. That's progress. That's what people call it. But the detective knows the truth. No matter how much concrete you pour, the past remains where it happened, pressed into the soil, into the air, into the memory of those who learned too late that distance doesn't equal safety. He wonders about the suspect, now locked into a new routine behind walls. He doesn't imagine suffering. He doesn't imagine revenge. He imagines something colder: time, long hours where the mind has nowhere to run but backward, nights where the sound of a door closing becomes unbearable, because it reminds you of the moment you crossed a line you can never uncross. He thinks about that phrase again, the one spoken into a recorder like a weak shield. I didn't mean for it to go like that. Meaning is irrelevant when outcomes are permanent. In the victim's family, the days after sentencing are strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not healed, just quiet in the way a room becomes quiet after years of constant noise. The question that dominated their lives has stopped moving, and they don't know what to do with the stillness. Some of them sleep for the first time in years. Others can't sleep at all. Some feel anger returning sharper now because now it has a target. Some feel emptiness because the long chase, hope again, has been replaced by a truth that doesn't offer a path forward. Certainty is heavy. It doesn't float like hope. Sinks. They begin to notice how much of their identity was built around the missing. How every holiday held space for a chair that stayed empty. How every year was measured not by birthdays, but by anniversaries of absence. How the case became a shadow that shaped everything without anyone realizing it. Now the shadow has edges. An edge is cut. The town holds a vigil. Not a media event. Not a performance, just a gathering with candles and folded hands. People stand in the cold, breath fogging the air, and listen as names are spoken. The victim's name is spoken the way it should have been spoken for decades. With truth, with weight, with a recognition that the person wasn't just a headline or a cold case file. They were a life. The pastor or the community leader, or the person brave enough to speak first says something about healing, about moving forward, about learning lessons. But lessons don't repair what was taken. They only explain it. The detective stands at the back, watching faces flicker in candlelight. He sees guilt in some eyes, not guilt of involvement but guilt of proximity. The guilt of not looking out the window, not asking one more question, not noticing the way someone's answers sounded too smooth. In small towns, everyone is connected by invisible threads. When one thread snaps, the whole web trembles. After the vigil, people go home and lock doors. They check windows. They tell themselves they're being careful, but deep down they know the truth. They are trying to reassemble an illusion that has been shattered. Because the scariest part was never the violence. The scariest part was the quiet, the absence of noise, the absence of witnesses, the absence of obvious danger. It proved something the town never wanted to learn. That evil can be polite, that it can knock and wait, that it can wear a voice you recognize and still carry intent underneath. It proved that the line between ordinary and catastrophic is thinner than anyone admits. The detective's phone rings late one night. A number he doesn't recognize. He answers out of habit, and a voice speaks softly on the other end. It's someone from the family. They don't say thank you in the way people imagine. They don't offer neat closure. They say something simpler, something that sounds almost like surrender. I keep thinking about the coffee, the voice says. It's such a small thing. But it feels like that's where everything stopped. The detective doesn't answer right away. He looks at the dark window in his kitchen, the reflection of his face faint against the glass, and he understands what they mean. Small things become anchors in grief. A mug, a coat, a stopped clock. Not because those objects mattered more than the person, but because they are proof that life was normal right up until it wasn't. They expected to come back, the family member says. It's not a question. Yes, the detective replies, voice low. They did. Silence stretches across the line. Then the voice says, so what do we do now? That question is the real ending of every cold case. Not who, not how, not even why. What now? The detective doesn't offer a speech. He doesn't offer empty comfort. He tells the truth that people rarely say out loud. Now you live, he says. And it's going to hurt. And it's going to be quiet in a different way. But you live. He hangs up and sits alone for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum, to the house settling, to the mundane sounds that make a life feel normal. He thinks about how those sounds were present in 1991 too. Indifferent to tragedy, continuing even as one family's world began to collapse. Days later, a local paper runs a final feature. Not sensational, not loud. A photograph of the victim, smiling in a moment that didn't know what was coming. A timeline. A brief mention of the tiny clue that changed everything. People read it and set it down. Some cry. Some stare. Some move on. But the phrase lingers in the town like smoke after a fire. One tiny clue changes everything. It becomes a warning and a prayer. A reminder that details matter, that silence can hide whole crimes, that the world can pivot on something as small as a faint mark near a curb. Months pass. The town adjusts the way towns do. It learns to speak the suspect's name without flinching. It learns to say the victim's name without whispering. It learns to tell the story to newcomers, not as a rumor, but as a truth with a verdict behind it. Yet every winter, when the air turns sharp and breath becomes visible, people remember. They remember the night a door opened. They remember the night a car arrived. They remember the nighttime stopped at 9:17. The detective eventually removes the file from his desk, places it in archives where it belongs. He watches the box slide onto a shelf among other boxes, other names, other unfinished echoes. He doesn't feel relief. He feels something closer to humility, because he knows how many cases never get their tiny clue, how many stories remain frozen, clock stopped, coffee cold forever, waiting for a hand that never comes. He walks out of the station into the winter air, pulls his coat tighter and pauses by his car. For a moment he listens to the street. Engines, distant voices, the soft churn of the town continuing its ordinary life. And he understands the final truth of this case, the one that never fits into headlines. Closure isn't an ending. It's a new kind of silence. A silence with a name. A silence with a place. A silence that no longer asks what happened. Only asks how did we miss it for so long? The detective starts the engine. The clock on the dashboard glows steady, hands moving forward without hesitation. Time, stubborn as ever, continues. But in the town of Ohio, in the winter air, in the memory of a door closing softly in the dark, 1991 still lingers, no longer a mystery, but an echo that will never fully fade. Because the case is closed. And yet, somewhere in the quiet you can still hear it. That tiny clue. That tiny mark. That one moment when everything changed.